Chapter 15 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 15. A man arrived one morning with a horse and a plow and several other implements of farm life of which Harley didn't know the name, and announced that Mr. Graham had sent him to plow the garden. Would Mrs. Hollister please tell him where she wanted the ground broken and how much? He volunteered the information that he was her next door neighbor, and that if he was in her place he'd plow the south slope of the meadow, and if she wanted flower beds, a strip along the front near the road. The soil was best in those spots, and she wouldn't need so much fertilizer. Mrs. Hollister asked him how much he would charge to do it, and he said a little job like that wasn't worth talking about, that he used to rent the barn himself, and he always did a little turn for Mr. Graham whenever he needed it. He did it for Mr. Graham, and it wouldn't cost her nothing. Mrs. Hollister asked him how much he would charge to see where it would be best to have the plowing done, and when she came in a few minutes later and dropped down on the couch to rest from her unusual fatigue, a new thought was racing through her mind. They could have a garden, a real garden, with lettuce and green peas and lima beans and corn. She knew all about making them grow. She had been brought up in a little village home where a garden was a part of everyone's necessary equipment for living. She used to help her father every spring and all summer. Her own little patch always took the prize of the family. But for years she had been in the city without an inch of space. Now, however, the old fever of delight in gardening took possession of her. If she could get out and work in the ground as the doctor had suggested, she would get well right away. And why, with Harley to help, and George and Carol to work a little every evening, couldn't they raise enough on all that ground to sell some? George could take things into town early in the morning, or they could find some private families who would buy all they had to sell. It was worth thinking about, anyway. She could raise flowers for sale, too. She had always been a success with flowers. She had always wanted a hothouse and a chance to experiment. She heard the children say there were some old window sashes down under the barn. She would get George to bring them out and see what she could do with a cold frame or two. Violets would grow under a cold frame, and lots of other things. Oh, if they could only just live here always and not have to go back to the city in the fall. But of course there was no way to heat the barn in winter, and that was out of the question. Nevertheless, the idea of making some money with growing things had seized hold of her mind and would not be entirely put by. She thought of it much, and talked of it now and then to Shirley and the other children. Shirley brought home some packages of seeds she got at the 10-cent store, and there was great excitement planting them. Then Mr. Graham sent over a lot of seeds of both vegetables and flowers, and some shrubs, cuttings, and bulbs, which he said were leftovers at their country house that he thought perhaps the children could use. And so, before the Hollisters knew it, they were possessed of a garden which almost in a breath lifted up its green head and began to grow. Life was very full for the Hollisters in those days, and those who went to the city for the day could hardly bear to tear themselves away from the many delights of the country. The puppy was getting bigger and wiser every day, tagging Doris and Harley wherever they went, or sitting adoringly at Mrs. Hollister's feet, always bounding out to meet the evening trolley on which George and Shirley came, and always attending them to the trolley in the morning. Out behind the barn a tiny coop held a white hen and her 7 little downy balls of chickens. Another hen was happily ensconced in a barrel of hay with 10 big blue duck eggs under her happy wings, and a little further down toward the creek a fine chicken run ended in a trig little roosting place for the poultry, which George had manufactured out of a packing box and some boards. The feathered family had been increased by 2 white leghorns and 3 bantams. George and Harley spent their evenings watching them and discussing the price of eggs and chickens per pound. They were all very happy. Elizabeth came out to spend Sunday as she had promised. She got up early to see the sunrise and watch the birds. She helped get breakfast and wash the dishes. Then she went with the others across the fields to the little white church in the valley, to Sunday school and church. She was as hungry and eager as any of them when she came home, and joyfully helped to do the work, taking great pride in the potatoes she was allowed to warm up under careful tutelage. In the afternoon there was no more eager listener among them to the Bible story Shirley told to Doris, and the book she read aloud to them all afterward. Her voice was sweetest and clearest of them all in the hymns they sang together, and she was most eager to go with Shirley to the Christian Endeavor. I shouldn't wonder if Sidney wishes he was here too," she remarked dreamily that evening as she sat before the fire on a little cushion, her chin in her hands, her eyes on the fantastic shadows in the ashes. She went to school with Carol the next morning, came home with her in the afternoon, and when her brother came for her in the evening she was most reluctant to go home to the big, lonely, elegant house again, and begged that Carol might soon come and see her. Friday afternoon Elizabeth called up Mrs. Hollister. "Please, Mrs. Hollister, let Carol come and stay with me till Monday. I'm so lonesome, and mamma says she will be so glad if you will let her come." " Oh, my dear, that would be impossible. Carol isn't suitably dressed to make a visit, you know," answered the mother quickly, glad that she had so good an excuse for keeping her child from this venture into an alien world about which she had many grave doubts. But the young voice at the other end of the telephone was insistent. "Dear Mrs. Hollister, please! She doesn't need any other clothes. I've got lots of things that would fit her. She loaned me her gingham dress to make garden in, and why shouldn't I loan her a dress to wear on Sunday? I've got plenty of clean middy blouses and skirts, and can fix her all out fresh for school too Monday morning. And if you'll just let her stay, Sidney will take us both down to her school when he goes to the office. You've got all those children there at home, and I've only myself. Sidney doesn't count, you know, for he's grown up." So with a sigh the mother gave her consent, and Carol found the Graham car waiting for her when she came out of school. Thus she started on her first venture into the world. It was all like fairyland, that wonderful week end to the little girl whose memories were full of burdens and sacrifices. The palatial home of many rooms and rich furnishings, the swarm of servants, the anticipation of every want, the wide, beautiful grounds, with all that heart could wish in the way of beauty and amusement, the music room with grand piano, harp, and violin lying mute most of the time, the great library with its walls lined with rare books, mostly unread, everything there to satisfy any whim, reasonable or unreasonable, and nobody using any of it much. "Not a room in the whole place as dear and cozy and homey as this," sighed Carol happily, sinking into the old denim covered couch before the fireplace in the barn living room that Monday night after she got home. "I declare, mother, I don't see how Elizabeth stands it. Her mother is nice, but she's hardly ever there, unless she has a swarm of people dinnering or teaing or lunching. She hardly ever has time to speak to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth doesn't seem to care much either. She almost seems to think more of that old nurse Susan that took care of her when she was a baby than she does of her mother. I'm so glad I was sent to you instead of to her." And Carol suddenly slipped across the room and buried her face in her mother's neck, hugging and kissing her, leaving a few bright tears on her mother's happy face. It was a wonderful relief to Mrs. Hollister to find her child unspoiled by her first experience of the world, and glad to get back to her home after all the anxiety her mother heart had felt. Carol presently sat up and told them minutely all about her visit, the grand concert that Sidney had taken them to Friday evening in the Academy of Music, where a world-renowned pianist was the soloist with the great symphony orchestra, the tennis and riding Saturday morning, the luncheon at a neighboring estate, where there were 3 girls and a brother who were snobs and hadn't at all good manners, the party in the evening that lasted so late that they didn't get to bed till long after midnight, the beautiful room they slept in, with every imaginable article for the toilet done in sterling silver with monograms, the strange Sabbath, with no service in the morning because they woke up too late, and no suggestion of anything but a holiday, except the vesper service in a cold, formal chapel that Carol had begged to go to. Just a lot of worldly music and entertaining, with a multitude of visitors for the end of it. Carol told of the beautiful dresses that Elizabeth had loaned her, coral crepe de chine accordion pleated for the concert, white with an orange sash for the luncheon, pale yellow with a black velvet girdle for the party, a little blue silk affair and another lovely white organdy for Sunday, and all with their accompanying silk stockings and slippers and gloves, and necklaces and bands for her hair. It was most wonderful to her, and as they listened they marveled that their Carol had come back to them so gladly, and rejoiced to see her nestling in her brown linen skirt and middy blouse close beside her mother's chair. She declared herself satisfied with her flight into the world. She might like to go again for a glimpse now and then, but she thought she would rather have Elizabeth out